Hey, welcome to Strategy Shorts episode 6, Card Evaluation. Today I'm going to go through some tips on how to get better at card evaluation before a set comes out. We're obviously in spoiler season for Immortal Vanguard right now, so I figured this was topical and relevant. So hopefully you find it useful in getting your head around each of the spoilers as they're revealed. Why is this important? So the cards aren't even out yet, right? Like surely once they're released we can play with them, find out if they're good or not. It doesn't really matter that much if we get a handle on it this early, does it? So I think being able to get a decent view of which cards are likely to be good, which cards are likely to be bad, and what they all do is actually really handy for guiding your early brewing sessions. If you have a more accurate picture of the potential meta, which cards might be relevant, which cards might be useful, that can guide your deck building and help you make those early choices and cuts when you're wondering how to fill up your 39 cards. It can give you ideas, it can give you a list of cards to try out, and if you're practicing for a tournament or thinking about a tournament at all, it can help you figure out what your opponents are likely to be playing based on what seems to be perceived as good and what you actually think will be good or will be relevant. On top of that, I think people tend to fall into a trap of saying this card is going to be disgusting, I'm going to have less fun, or this card is going to be bad, I'm not going to play it, both of which can be counterproductive. One, because it makes you, enjoy yourself less, and the second because it makes you miss out on options you might otherwise pick up on for building your decks early on, and indeed later on in the format. Without people to try stuff, we might never learn how good a card is. So it's important to have something of a view on the breadth of possibilities, which cards might be relevant when, and why. That sounds a whole lot more complicated than people probably at first assume goes into looking at a new card, right? You look at a card, you're like, that's sweet, or that's terrible, or whatever. You make your Reddit comment, you move on with your life. I like to try and go a bit deeper than that. So if you're interested, let's go. Rule number 1, have fun. Sounds like kind of a dumb rule. It's like, what does that got to do with accurately gauging a card? I find that it really helps me to approach, especially weird or wonky or expensive cards, things like Evolutionary Apex, or that 9-mana Vitruvian spell that just got spoiled, that replaces your whole hand with random cards that cost 4 less, random Vitruvian cards. I find it helps to approach those with a sense of fun, right? These cards are not the most efficient, the most streamlined, immediate tournament playable cards. They're probably mostly jank. That's fine, right? Meme cards exist for good reason. We can have fun with them without them needing to break the game. But looking at a card like this and seeing the upside is valuable, rather than focusing on, oh my god, it's 9 mana, you're never going to get to cast that, what if you get bad cards? You look at it and think, wow, that's pretty sweet, like I could get all kinds of stupid stuff, and you imagine a turn where you cast Circle of Desiccation, then 2 Imara healers immediately, and you're like, oh, this is going to be so nuts. And obviously most of the time it's not going to do that. But it can help you find the potential in the card and start experimenting with a shell. Plus, personally for me, I like being optimistic about cards. I think it's more fun for me. It's maybe nicer to read than opposed to saying, this is terrible, I'm not good to play it. But I think it helps my personal enjoyment of and engagement with the game. It's kind of, again, less important if you're purely looking to rank cards based on how good you think they'll be. But at least it helps me keep open-minded. Rule 2. This is a process I call what does it do? And it goes something like this. Cards do not exist in a vacuum. A card is part of a deck, is played against another deck within a metagame round after round with different opponents. Every time you draw it, your hand will be different, the board will be different, the game state will be different, your opinion on what's in your opponent's hand will be different. So, an important part of card evaluation is figuring out, most of the time, when you draw this card, What will it actually do? In what way will it affect the game? So a really good example of this, I'm going to use a couple of cards as recurring examples, is Wild Star. I'll just pull this up on the screen. This is why I'm on the other side today. So Wild Tar, if you can't see it in the video, it's a 2/4 for 3 with Frenzy. It's a common. Whenever an enemy attacks, it gets +3 attack until the end of your next turn. So this is powerful, threatening counter-attacker. This card generated a lot of discussion when it was spoiled and before its release. And in general, its actual impact on the metagame has been, no one actually plays it. Why is that? Well, although the card is very scary, there's a lot of powerful abuses that you can make with it, right? If your opponent attacks, it becomes a 5/4 or an 8/4, and then, you can miss Dragon Seal it and blow up a bunch of stuff. But in practice, they can just not attack and try and find removal for it. Or, they can ping it with something and then trade in their general and take 5, and that sort of sucks for them, but it's not that much different than just getting rid of a Yun, right? The battle pet, 5/4 battle pet for 3. So although the card is powerful, in theory, in practice, because it gives your opponent a choice on how well it works, it doesn't go off very often. Certainly in the explosive way that people were afraid of. And so, thinking about what this card will actually do, when you put it on the table, what does your opponent do in response? Let's look at Thunderhorn, another one. 4/5 for 4. When it damages an enemy, it also damages all joined enemies. That ability is disgustingly powerful, right? This card is, in abstract, extremely strong. And there are awful things you could do with it with Aspect of Shimzar and so on. But when you play this in a game, what does your opponent do? They spread out. They can play around it. So your opponent's options for counterplay and your own, the foibles of your own draws will make it a bit awkward. Like Thunderhorn is great, but it also doesn't protect itself or counterattack particularly well against single minions, which means that it can be outsized the turn it comes down. Unlike something like a Sunsteel Defender, where your opponent has to pay particular attention into getting rid of the force field, Thunderhorn can just get eaten by a bigger minion or a removal spell. And that's also a strike against the card. And so in practice, the amount of times you get to play your Thunderhorn and then attack with it and chain and hit 3 things, that's very small. Your opponent always has to respect the possibility, which makes the card more interesting, but because your opponent respects that possibility, it actually very rarely happens in practice. For the other side of what does it do, look at Grandmaster Embler. This card, I think, made a very little splash when it was spoiled, as I recall. People, very much including myself, didn't think much of it. And then, the first time you cast this card, there's a realization. You're like, let's try this card out. I'll put it in my deck, I'll put Razorback in, what have you. I played it in a Kara deck. If you play this with Kara, your opponent gets surrounded by like 18 powers worth of walls and can't move. And then they just die. It's bonkers. And if you think about it, what does this card do? Well, it puts somewhere between 0 and 24 power into play surrounding your opponent, plus a 5/5. It goes well with Razorback, it goes well with Kinetic Surge. It threatens a lot of damage as well as restricting their movement. And if the board is relatively clear, so your opponent can't just eat away the walls easily, it's ridiculous. Like, it's very hard for them to get out of that, and the remaining walls, after they've chowed a few of them down, will generally protect you. So the card is good defensively or offensively. That's not very obvious because it costs a ton of mana, and it has this weird text that doesn't really make sense. Like, why would I want to do that? It's just blocking them in. But actually, because it can make 3/3 walls, it can do a surprising amount. And so you look at Embler, you say, what does this card do? Well, actually, it puts a bunch of stuff into play surrounding my opponent. It can threaten lethal with any number of minor combos, or even just if my opponent's on low life, and I hit a couple of Blazing Spines. Probably still kills them. Rule 3. It's probably not as bad as you think. This is kind of a corollary to the last one. So I'm going to go back to Wild Tar again. Wild Tar and Thunderhorn both had people saying, wow, this is going to spoil the game for me. I'm not interested in playing against this card. On paper, that's entirely reasonable. These cards look really scary. They're pretty bonkers. However, it's been fine, right? Wild Tar sees very little play. Thunderhorn sees a decent amount of play, but not a huge amount. It's not in every deck. It's mostly in mid-rangey good stuff decks, which is, it's a mid-range good stuff card, right? That's kind of makes sense. It doesn't have that much particular synergy, and so decks with more streamlined game plans leave it out, which is ideal. In my opinion, that's where it should be. So to some extent, this is confirmation bias, right? There have been broken cards. Some of them, we called it ahead of time. You know, people looked at the card and were like, this is broken. The card came out, it was broken, it got nerfed. Other times, even the most powerful cards have sort of slotted into the meta and been okay. Lava Slasher is not even that played nowadays. You know, there are some Magma lists cutting them because although it was very strong, especially when it first came out, there were certainly other cards that could compete with it, other strategies like Arcanist Fae at the time, and now there's loads of good 4/5s and similar like high health cards that don't just die to it, and things like Thunderhorn, which is very good against Lava Slasher. So with a small shift in the meta, the card becomes much more fair without needing a nerf. And I would argue that it didn't massively need a nerf in the first place. Like, it was pretty helpful to have something to prey on Holy Immolation decks, because it was at its best against Tempo Argent as a card. And so having a pushed card in that position actually helped to some extent, although we did end up with a polarized 2-deck meta in the end. So Lava Slasher, not an amazing example, because that card is a bit broken, but it still hasn't like ruined the game. And the motivation behind this idea, right, it's not so much that like, oh, sometimes you might be wrong, because duh, right? We know that. Everyone knows that. It's more that I tend to prefer erring on the side of assuming the devs probably know what they're doing, right? Like, certainly when the cards, before the cards even come out, they've played with them more than we have. That reverses very quickly once the cards are in the wild, but for the time being, the devs are giving us a set of cards they think will provide interesting deck building decisions and a balanced varied meta. Whether or not they're right, I don't know, but I think usually on site is too early to call a card broken, especially when it does something weird, offers your opponent a bit more say in the proceedings, like most Duelyst cards do thanks to the positional mechanics, or has an easy counter. Something like Lava Slasher didn't really have an easy counter at the time, but now its natural prey is diminished, and there's a lot more like reasonably big, highish toughness minions in the field. The last rule is kind of the opposite of this. The last rule is rule 4: give it a chance. It is always very tempting to look at a card and say, that's bad. It's almost like satisfying, right? Nope, it's bad. I'm going to pass judgment on this card. Close the book. In my view, this is the most insidious one. I mean, I don't really enjoy having conversations about why card X is going to ruin the game, because it's not very fun. It's like, that's just a personal preference though. But what does make me sad is when people dismiss cards because they don't obviously fit into a deck, because they look a bit bad, because some cards read worse than they play, or because they don't make much sense. There are a lot of things that can change between your sight of that card and the expansion's release. For a start, more cards. Right? This card might combo with something we haven't seen yet. This card might be supported by a deck or by other cards that we haven't seen yet. It might be very good against decks or cards that we haven't seen yet that will be a dominant force in the meta, and so on. The other thing is that, especially when there are new mechanics, right, we're seeing this right now with Build at the time of recording, where I think the common perception is that build is bad, which seems like a very final statement to make on a new and very unusual mechanic. For those who haven't seen them yet, build cards don't manifest immediately when you play them. You get a little structure that says 0-10 with a timer on it, according to the build number. So your card will have like build 1 or build 3 or whatever. In that many turns, the structure transforms back into your card, undamaged and ready to attack. So, for instance, there's a 2 mana 10-10 with build 3. So if you play it on turn 2, you have to wait until turn 2. Turn 1, you have to wait until turn 4 to actually attack with it. By which point your opponent can be out of position, they can have fun removal, and so on. This lag, this vulnerability, coupled with, build cards being bad top decks, does make it quite easy to say, yeah, that card probably sucks. But I think there's going to be more to it than that. I think the mechanic is quite interesting. And I think there are going to be lots of pros as well as cons to build cards. In particular, because we haven't seen all the build cards yet, there may well be very strong ones that are much easier to activate in a format where your opponent has pressure on you or has removal in hand. Although the mechanic might turn out to be unilaterally useless, I think it's hard to... I think writing it off at this stage is counterproductive. Like, these cards might be great. We haven't played with the mechanic yet. They, if nothing else, will be interesting in Gauntlet, and I look forward to seeing that work. But if we just sit there and go, this is terrible, we're going to end up not building decks with the cards, right? Someone has to actually try them. And so I think looking at a card and going, this is potentially useful because it might do X, Y, Z, or this is potentially useful if the meta looks like this, or if this card is printed in this set or in a future set. I think that's actually a really valuable thing to do, even if it's tenuous, right? This card is good if and only if, like, I don't know, Obelisk Xerex drops off the meta entirely and is replaced by, like, I don't know, Pyromancer. Like, if Pyromancer becomes the number one thing in the meta, then your new tech card that destroys a blast unit will be amazing, or whatever. As is often the case with tech cards. But I think those are a bit more obvious. You know, if the meta is smallish units skirmishing around the center of the board, delayed 10-10 might be great. Who knows? So I think I like to try and figure out what a card could do if it had the chance. What's the upside and what's the downside? Because again, this is not all about saying every card is good. This is more about saying, I think this card could work. I think this card could have this impact on the board if it worked. How do I make it work? Because a lot of deck building is about solving those puzzles, about taking cards that are narrow or bad on their own or otherwise clunky or impractical and turning them into lean, mean killing machines rather than just building good stuff decks. I see this a lot in Magic. Magic the Gathering has a standard format where it's everything from the past 2 years worth of sets, roughly. And it's one of the main competitive formats of the game. So when cards come out, people tend to evaluate them for standard. And usually only the higher rarity cards are pushed in that direction, along with a small number of lower rarity cards. And the vast majority of cards are just aimed at draft. Which means that if you're looking at this set from a standard lens, like that's trash, that's trash, that's trash, that might be playable. And if you're looking at it as a drafter, it's like, this is great. All these cards are fun. And people will dismiss stuff out of hand because it's, you know, not good enough to see play in this particular deck that already exists. You know, not thinking about the future meta. Or people will dismiss a card because it just doesn't have the raw numbers on it, and maybe miss out on it slotting into some kind of more niche deck, or a combo deck, or some other strange design. By saying to yourself, this is bad, full stop, on seeing a card, you might lock yourself out to learning something from it, to playing with it, to brewing with it. You might be the person who breaks this. You might be the one who says, oh wow, I've actually found something sick to do with this bad card. Now I'm going to take over the meta, right? So much of deck building and puzzle solving is about that. So I think it's very important to leave yourself open to a card being better than it looks, or working out in some situations, and trying to figure out what that might be. We obviously can't get it right ahead of time. The game is too interesting for that, right? If we could figure out cards perfectly when they came out, it'd be boring. Like, the spoilers are revealed, you're like, oh yes, I'll build this deck. You build your deck and you go directly to S rank or whatever, along with everyone else who's built exactly the same thing. That's boring. So we are going to get cards wrong. But to wrap up, to segue to the full circle wrap up, I think there's a lot of value in trying to remain open-minded, trying to actually think about how a card would work on the table, what might make it not as powerful as it seems, what might make it not as bad as it seems, and try and figure out its limitations, what it needs to work, what might counter it if it's really good, where it might fit into the meta, and where it might fit into decks. It's kind of a lot of thought, and sometimes it's easier just to look at a card and go, you know, I could sit around and figure this out, but I think it's alright. I'm going to go and make some tea. You can do that if you want, that's fine. No one is, obviously. This is all optional. This is purely my own personal approach that I just wanted to share. Take from it what you will. But I think having a flexible, kind of more favorable, I guess, approach to card evaluation has really helped me. It's helped me brew decks, it's helped me enjoy the game, it's helped me engage with the format when it comes out. It's helped me get a picture of what the meta might be like. It's helped me test for tournaments. I had a DWC qualifier once, like 2 days after the release of Rise of the Bloodborne. So you better bet I was evaluating those cards as hard as I could. And I personally enjoy it more. I think it's nicer to try and solve the puzzle. You know, hypothetically, this card could be great if, and it may not be. That's fine. You know, I'm not going to be right all the time, but it's nice to. I feel like there's actually a decent amount of headway you can make in getting a head start on the format. Plus, of course, all of this really builds into helping you draft, because card evaluation is a very important skill for Gordon. And so being able to think in a more complete way about a card's potential upsides, downsides, limitations, and support really helps you do exactly the same thing when you're presented with a pick in draft. Which I guess, fully exploring that's a topic for another video, but I'm going to wrap this one up now, because as usual, it's not actually short. Thank you all very much for watching. Again, please let me know, as usual, please let me know if you have questions, or you want to talk about cards. I'm always on Reddit. I check Discord regularly, and I'm in game. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time.